Thank you very much. It's interesting. I think that the pivot to Asia by the United States began under Obama, and yet if you think about what has happened, what's kind of taken up an awful lot of American diplomatic and foreign policy time in the last decade or so, it's actually inevitably become the Middle East. I mean, it's extraordinary that, in a sense, the Middle East shouldn't matter that much to America, but it always drags American policymakers back in. So a slightly jaundiced note. Any questions, please, from the audience? Because we have 8 minutes left, and I invite any questions. If not, I have a question for Jean-Pierre.
There's a question over
there.
there.
Question there? Sorry, I can't.
I can see.
There we go, yes. If you can identify yourself, that would be very kind.
Hello, I'm Farid Yassin. I used to be the Iraqi ambassador to the United States. I think
Ahlan wa sahlan.
At the World Policy Conference a few years ago,
yeah.
Under Obama, the concept of the pivot to Asia was raised. And my question then was, what about the pivot by Asia? So now, 8 years later, can anybody add something to that on the concept of the pivot by Asia? What are the new strategies of the leaders of the...
Interesting question. You mean, in what sense has Asia's overall foreign policy direction moved?
At the time, the person who answered the question was the head of Lafarge,
yeah.
a French company. And he said he saw it very visibly in the fact that many leaders of Chinese companies were much more aggressive in the rest of the world than they had been previously.
Interesting. Jean-Pierre?
The Asian pivot?
Yes, the pivot by Asia towards, towards the Middle East, for example, towards Iraq.
Well, China has been very active in the Middle East.
But also to Africa.
And Africa as well. But I would argue that actually the new priorities of the Chinese diplomacy today are more the Middle East and Latin America than Africa. Actually, if you look at the amount of trade between China and Latin America, is twice bigger actually than between China and Africa. It's around nearly 600 billion US against 300 billion US. So, and the Middle East is a growing partner of China, both the Saudi Arabia, Emirates, but also Iran and other countries in the Middle East. So, but I would add to that actually Asian countries compete for influence in other parts of the world. So in other words, the so-called global South is also very fragmented. And we had a session just before this one with IMEC, which underscores the fact that India is also very active in the Middle East and also India is also active in Africa to some extent. So we see major powers also competing, not to mention Japan and countries which have been in the global South for a much longer period of time. So Asia, yes, is also reaching out other parts of the world, but there are several actors doing that, and that's part of the multipolarization of the world, and including of Asia.
Thank you. A quick question to Douglas. I mean, I think it was Jean-Pierre who mentioned the Philippines and the tensions there. I mean, Biden obviously said 4 times at least that America would defend Taiwan. Whether that's true under a Trump administration is another matter. What about the Philippines? If they become, Philippines is a treaty partner of the United States. And I'm somewhat surprised that the Philippines is going to for arbitration again, having won the first time. Why do they need to go a second time? But nonetheless, Douglas, do you think the US would actually intervene on behalf of Manila?
Well, it matters what the topic or the cause of the conflict is. I think recently we had a few months ago, we had a concern that Scarborough Shoal and related shoals would be a pretext for some kind of conflict between the Philippines and China that would draw the US in. And I can tell you that American military figures do not think that should be the beginning of the war between the United States and China. And the Chinese also felt that that was not a place where we should test each other. The Philippines went through a period of sort of testing it, and they themselves, I think in consultation with the US, decided to take an initiative to lower the temperature around the shoals. And I think the US and China both welcomed the Philippines' decision to seek some kind of conciliation on management of the existing dispute between China and the Philippines.
Do you think it's a sort of a domestic politics thing in the Philippines as well? Because, I mean, Duterte obviously had this sort of pro-China policy when he first came to power, and it seemed to change.
Well,
and
I
now
would characterize
Bongbong Marcos
I always
has
thought
it as well.
Duterte was more anti-American than he was pro-China.
Yeah.
It's deep in his blood, and we had to deal with that, and it was an awkward, we didn't deal with it very effectively in my view. We've had weak leadership in our embassy since the Bush administration on, and we could do a better job with our Philippine friends than we have done at the past. But to give credit to the Biden administration, they have really stepped up to manage affairs better bilaterally with the Philippines, and you're seeing that in the expansion of access to facilities in the Philippines, improved exercise conditions, and I think the kind of diplomacy that's taking place is also keeping the Philippines strong relative to China, given the conditions the Philippines operates under, but not provocative.
Yeah. Thank you. Question there from Michel, I think, Michel Foucault. Foucault. No.
It's coming.
Yes. Could you come back to the content, benefits, possible impact on the Korean Peninsula of the last treaty of so-called global strategic partnership between Moscow and Pyongyang? I suppose it was a Russian initiative. Could you confirm that? And it's an opportunity for South Korea to observe on the field North Korean soldiers and some generals also. What is your assessment? Because it's a real shock, a change for the peninsula.
Good question. Mr. Hur, yeah.
I'm not quite sure whether it's the Russian initiative or North Korean initiative, but I guess they have a common interest. They both tried to go around all these sanctions, particularly from North Korea's point of view. There's already sanctions imposed on that country. I mean, it's the same for Russia, and they both found the common interest in having this relationship. Having said that, what I'm told by the experts is that this sort of a mutual defense agreement still has many loopholes, so that despite what appears as a close alliance, particularly from the Russian point of view, they can already walk away from the deal. But I have not seen word by word the treaty itself. And it's a severely destabilizing force, definitely. Many Koreans are shocked. And it has a potential that some kind of conflict can easily flare up to the global scale, and that's really scary. And apparently North Korea is said to get some energy as well as food, but more importantly, some technology to further develop their ICBM and missile capacities. And that's a really worrisome element of this deal. And that's the reason why that the alliance between Korea and Japan and the US, despite all the change of those people who signed on this declaration of Camp David Declaration, should be continued to be cemented and strengthened in many ways, despite the change of the government in all those three countries, because the underlying interest, strategic interest, does not change despite the change of the figure at the top.
Yeah, good point. Douglas, you had one of the...
I was just going to say there's been a studied silence from China on this agreement between Russia and North Korea. And I think the reason underlying that, although you can't ask the Chinese because they won't respond, the reason appears to be that North Korea has bought itself more maneuvering room. They've been hostage to whatever China would or would not do on their behalf, and they now have the ability to play Moscow against Beijing, which they did in the 50s and 60s, but haven't been able to do since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so I think this was an opportunity for North Korea to take advantage of Russia's needs for weaponry and the like, soldiers, to get what they wanted, which was more maneuverability vis-a-vis China.
Yeah, good point. China must be pretty disappointed by its friendship without limits with Russia. I mean, given that Russia's done so badly in real terms in Ukraine, and now is no longer is under pressure to leave Syria, it hasn't actually worked out very well for China from, I think, a selfish Chinese point of view.
I just want to say that recently China unilaterally lifted the visa requirement, short-term visa requirement for Korea, and many people interpret it as a way to show displeasure toward North Korea's close alliance with Russia.
Excellent. We have run over time, and dinner is approaching, and I don't want to... Oh, there is a last question, a brief question, if you wouldn't mind, and brief responses.
Okay, very brief. Thank you, gentlemen. Donald Trump has said that any person or company investing $1 billion or more in the US would receive fully expedited approvals and permits, including, but in no way limited to, all environmental approvals. At the same time, China is raising the bar on its environmental requirements for all industries, particularly energy and hard-to-abate industries. Do you think that Europeans developing CBAM and the likes are likelier to align with China and with Asia rather than the US, and that could provoke another type of pivot from an industrial point of view?
Oh, good question. I don't know, who would like to answer that?
I mean, this is all very late-breaking news. We don't know the details, but the United States Supreme Court decided last week that the massive amount of environmental reporting required for investments in the U.S. was superfluous and should be avoided. So I think Trump is taking advantage of that to turn it into something he can trade with. But in fact, it's a fait accompli versus, done by the U.S. courts.
Jean-Pierre.
Well, just two points on this issue, climate change and the COP negotiation. Of course, China is trying to reach out the European and other developed economies in order to sort of create some kind of a consensus on those issues. But there are two obstacles to really move towards some kind of consensus between China and the US and the EU on that. The first one has to do with climate finance. I think, as you say, as you may know, that China considers itself as a developing economy, and as a result, its contribution to the climate finance is only voluntary. It doesn't mean that China is not going to contribute anything, but it's really going to be on a bilateral basis, and as you know, depending very much on China's own plans. And the other issue is the carbon tax that the EU is going to introduce very soon, and which is going to be, of course, which has been criticized by China, which is going to be a new element of friction between the EU and China, including on climate change. So I don't see united front between China and the EU really taking shape. There is dialogue. There will continue to be dialogue, but I don't think.
But the carbon mechanisms, border mechanisms, due to come in next year, or
yes,
or 2000 or 26. I can't remember.
25. Maybe I'm wrong, but yeah, I've seen. I think it's 25.
I think dinner is on your minds. So whether it's on the minds of the panel, I don't know, but I think they've done a terrific job, and they deserve a very good round of applause. Thank you very, very much.